It was June 25, 1980, inside the hallowed, velvet-lined walls of Carnegie Hall in New York City. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, stale cigarette smoke, and the electric, terrifying weight of expectation. Frank Sinatra, the chairman of the board, stood at center stage, bathed in a single, unforgiving spotlight that caught the beads of sweat on his forehead and the deep, etched lines of a life lived too hard and too fast. He was 64 years old, and though the tuxedo was still pressed to perfection, the man inside it was tired, a bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of Jack Daniels or applause could wash away. He was moving into the final crescendo of My Way, his anthem, his shield, the song that told the world he was untouchable. But in the fourth row, a shadow was rising, a man who didn't see a legend, but a lie, a man whose hands were calloused from 40 years of labor that had left him with nothing. As Frank drew a breath for the final soaring note, a scream tore through the silence of the theater, shattering the moment like a dropped whiskey glass. "It's a lie, Frank. It's all a goddamn lie. By the way, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from?" The orchestra froze. The conductor's baton halted in mid-air. 2,800 people turned their heads in a collective gasp, the sound of silk rustling like a nervous wind. Frank Sinatra, a man known for a temper that could level buildings, a man who had thrown tables and punched photographers, did not signal security. He did not scream back. He simply lowered the microphone, his blue eyes narrowing, piercing through the darkness to find the source of the disturbance. For 10 agonizing seconds, the most famous singer in the world and a broken, anonymous construction worker stared at each other across a divide of wealth and fame that seemed impossible to bridge. What happened next wasn't just a concert moment. It was a collision of two American dreams, one realized and one destroyed, and the decision Frank made in that silence would reveal more about his soul than 1,000 records ever could. To understand why this night became a legend whispered about by stagehands for decades, we have to go back 3 weeks to a small, dim apartment in Queens. Arthur Miller was sitting at a Formica kitchen table that wobbled every time he leaned his elbows on it. The room smelled of boiled cabbage and old dust. Arthur was 61, a veteran of the Second World War, a man who had built the skyscrapers of Manhattan, riveting steel beams while hanging hundreds of feet in the air. He had built the city that Frank Sinatra sang about, but the city didn't care about Arthur. 2 months prior, Arthur's pension fund had collapsed, dissolved in a corporate merger that the newspapers called necessary restructuring, and Arthur called theft. Then, the diagnosis came for his wife, Martha. It wasn't leukemia like the boy in the other stories. It was a heart condition, treatable but expensive. Without the pension, without the insurance he had been promised for 30 years of loyalty, Arthur couldn't pay for the specialists. He watched the woman he had loved since 1946 fade away in a county hospital hallway because there were no beds available. She died on a Tuesday. On Wednesday, Arthur found an eviction notice on his door. He was a man who had done everything right. He had followed the rules. He had paid his taxes. And now he was alone, broke and drowning in a rage so hot it felt like it was burning a hole in his chest. That evening, the television was on, a flickering black and white set showing a commercial for Frank Sinatra's upcoming homecoming at Carnegie Hall. The announcer's voice was full of hype. The man who has it all, the king of New York, celebrating the good life. Arthur stared at the screen. He saw Frank's face, tan, smiling, holding a glass of champagne. He saw the tuxedo worth more than Arthur's car. He saw the arrogance of a man who claimed to represent the little guy while living in a palace in Palm Springs. Something inside Arthur snapped. It wasn't a rational thought. It was the desperate, illogical logic of grief. "He's laughing at us," Arthur whispered to the empty room. "He's singing about a city that eats people like me, and he's telling us it's a wonderful world." Arthur went to the jar where he kept the money for his own funeral. He took it all out. He bought a ticket, 4th row. He didn't go to hear the music. He went to tell the truth. If you enjoy stories about the hidden humanity behind the legends, please subscribe for new stories. Backstage at Carnegie Hall, 1 hour before the curtain rose, the atmosphere was suffocating. Frank sat in his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the bulb-lined mirror. The old blue eyes, looking back at him, seemed unfamiliar. The 1980s were dawning, bringing with them a new world of synthesizers and MTV, a world where guys in tuxedos singing standards felt like dinosaurs. Frank was terrified of irrelevance. He would never admit it, not to his wife, Barbara, not to his manager, and certainly not to the public, but the fear was there, gnawing at him at 3 a.m. "Do they still hear me?" he had asked Jilly Rizzo earlier that afternoon. "They love you, Frank. You're the chairman," Jilly had said, pouring a drink. "They love the memory of me," Frank had muttered, straightening his cufflinks. "They love love the guy from 1955. I don't know if they give a damn about the guy in this chair. He took a sip of Jack Daniels, 3 ice cubes, 2 fingers of water. It was his ritual. It was supposed to calm the nerves, but tonight his hands were trembling slightly. He felt a heavy melancholy, the black dog of depression that had followed him his whole life. He missed his mother, Dolly. He missed the guys who were gone. He felt the weight of every mistake, every failed marriage, every lost friend. When the stage manager knocked on the door and said, "5 minutes, Mr. Sinatra," Frank stood up, put on the mask of the invincible superstar, and walked toward the light. He had no idea that the man who could strip that mask away was waiting just 50 feet from the microphone. The concert began with an explosion of brass. Count Basie's orchestra kicked into "The Best Is Yet to Come." Frank strutted out, catching the light, smiling that $1,000,000 smile. The crowd erupted. For the first 40 minutes, it was magic. He joked, he toasted the audience, he sang "Fly Me to the Moon" with a swing that made everyone forget their troubles. But Arthur Miller didn't forget. He sat in the 4th row, wearing his only suit, a charcoal gray one he had bought for his daughter's wedding 10 years ago. It was tight around the shoulders now. He didn't clap, he didn't smile, he just watched Frank, feeding the fire in his belly. Every time Frank made a joke about booze or broads, Arthur felt a fresh wave of nausea. "My wife is dead," Arthur thought, "and you're making jokes about having too many martinis." The tension in Arthur's chest was physical, a tightening screw. Then the lights dimmed. The orchestra slowed down. The piano began the opening chords of "My Way." It was the moment everyone had waited for. The song about living life on your own terms, about having no regrets. "And now the end is near," Frank crooned, his voice rich with experience. Arthur started to shake. The end is near. Yes, the end was near for Arthur. The end of his dignity. The end of his home. And here was this man, this millionaire, boasting about how he ate it up and spit it out. "I did it my way," Frank belted out, throwing his arms wide, the king of the world. Arthur stood up. He didn't plan it. His legs just moved. "It's a lie!" Arthur screamed. The music didn't stop immediately. Frank looked down, squinting against the glare. "You're a liar, Frank!" Arthur shouted louder, his voice cracking with the strain of weeks of silence. "You talk about doing it your way? What about us? What about the guys who did it the right way and got nothing?" The orchestra trailed off into a dissonant jumble of notes. Security guards in the wings tensed, their hands going to their belts. 2 large men in blazers started moving down the aisle toward Arthur. The audience began to murmur, an ugly sound of annoyance and judgment. "Sit down," someone hissed. "Get him out of here," another voice called. Frank Sinatra raised a hand, a single sharp gesture. "Stop." The security guards froze. The audience fell silent. Frank stepped to the edge of the stage. He looked down at Arthur. In the past, Frank might have told the guy to get lost. He might have made a crude joke. He might have had him thrown out the back door. But tonight, Frank saw something in Arthur's face that stopped him cold. He saw the same thing he saw in the mirror at 3 a.m. He saw a man who was hurting. "What's your name, pal?" Frank asked. He didn't use the microphone, but his voice carried in the silent hall. "Arthur," the man choked out. "Arthur Miller." "Well, Arthur," Frank said, crouching down on one knee, ruining the crease in his trousers, bringing himself to eye level with the man. "You seem pretty angry at me. You want to tell me why I'm a liar? You sing about New York," Arthur said, tears finally spilling over his rough cheeks. "You sing about this city like it's a paradise. I built this city, Frank. I put the steel in the sky, and when my wife got sick, when Martha got sick, this city let her die in a hallway because I couldn't pay. I did it the right way. I worked, I served, and I got nothing. And you stand there in that tuxedo and tell me you did it your way? It's a joke." The silence in Carnegie Hall was absolute. No one breathed. This wasn't a show anymore. This was a confession. Frank stayed crouched for a long moment. He looked at Arthur's hands, clenched into fists, trembling. He looked at the cheap suit. He looked at the grief that was so raw it felt like heat coming off the man. Frank stood up slowly. He turned his back on the audience for a second, wiping his face with a handkerchief. When he turned back, the mask was gone. The arrogance was gone. He signaled the orchestra leader. "Cut the chart," Frank said softly. "Kill the lights." The massive spotlights died, leaving only a ghost light on the stage, casting long shadows. Frank dragged a stool to the center of the stage. He sat down, looking not like a star, but like an old man in a bar at closing time. "Arthur," Frank said into the microphone, his voice raspy and intimate. "You're right." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. "You're right," Frank repeated. "I wear this tux. I drink the best booze. I fly in private jets. I got lucky. I got a voice that people wanted to hear, and I got breaks that other guys didn't get. And I know this city can be a cold, hard bitch. I was born in Hoboken, Arthur. I know what it's like to have nothing, but I forgot. Sometimes up here, I forget." Frank took a cigarette from the silver case on the piano, lit it, and watched the smoke curl up into the dark rafters. "I lost people too, Arthur. Not like you, but I lost them. And every night when the lights go out and the applause applause stops, I go back to a hotel room and I'm just a guy scared of the dark. But that doesn't fix what happened to your Martha, and it doesn't make me less of a fraud in your eyes." Frank looked out at the darkness of the hall, addressing the thousands of people who were witnessing this. "We come here to forget," Frank said. "You pay your money to hear me sing so you can forget for 2 hours that life is hard, and I sing so I can forget that I'm getting old and scared. But Arthur here, he can't forget, and he shouldn't have to listen to me brag about doing it my way when he didn't even get a choice." Frank turned back to Arthur. "I can't bring Martha back. I can't fix the pension fund, but I can do one thing. I can stop singing about the fantasy and sing about the truth." He looked at his pianist, Bill Miller. No relation to Arthur, but the coincidence hung in the air. "Bill," Frank said, "one for my baby, and keep it slow, real slow. If you want to support our channel and hear more deeply human stories like this, please subscribe for new stories." The piano notes started, the iconic, melancholic intro that sounds like rain on a pavement at 4:01 a.m. Frank didn't stand up. He stayed on the stool, cigarette burning in one hand, microphone in the other. He didn't sing it like a performance. He sang it like a conversation. "It's 2:45. There's no one in the place except you and me." He looked directly at Arthur. He wasn't singing to the balcony. He wasn't singing to the critics. He was singing to the man in the 4th row who had lost everything. "So set 'em up, Joe. I got a little story I think you should know." The lyrics took on a new meaning. It wasn't about a breakup anymore. It was about loss. It was about the crushing weight of existing in a world that doesn't care if you live or die. Frank's voice cracked on the line. "I'm a little gloomy." It wasn't a technique. It was real. He was pouring his own pain, his own guilt, his own fear into the song and offering it to Arthur as an apology. Arthur slowly sank back into his seat, his fists unclenched. He wept openly, his shoulders shaking, but he wasn't screaming anymore. He felt seen. For the first time since Martha died, he didn't feel invisible. The most famous man on earth was singing a lullaby for his pain. When the song ended, there was no big finish, no high note. Frank just whispered, "The long, long way," and let the silence hang there. He stood up and walked to the edge of the stage again. "Arthur," he said, "don't go anywhere after the show. I want to have a drink with you, a real drink." Then he looked at security. "If anyone touches him, they answer to me." The rest of the concert was different. The bombast was gone. Frank sang ballads. He sang "Send in the Clowns" with a fragility that broke hearts. He sang "I've Got You Under My Skin," not as a swing tune, but as a desperate plea. The audience didn't cheer wildly anymore. They listened with a reverence that is rare in show business. They understood that the show had changed. It wasn't a celebration of success. It was a vigil for the broken. If you are moved by moments of unexpected kindness, subscribe for new stories to keep these memories alive. After the curtain fell, the dressing room was cleared out. No hangers-on, no press. Just Frank, his bodyguard, and Arthur Miller. Arthur stood by the door, still clutching his hat, looking terrified now that the anger had drained away. Frank was sitting in his robe, wiping off his makeup. He looked older without the stage lights. He turned and pointed to the chair next to him. "Sit down, Arthur. Jack Daniels, right?" Arthur nodded, speechless. Frank poured 2 glasses. No ice. He handed one to the construction worker. "To Martha," Frank said, raising his glass. "To Martha," Arthur whispered. Their glasses clinked, crystal against crystal, a sound that bridged 2 different worlds. They sat for an hour. Frank didn't talk about Hollywood. He asked about the steel beams. He asked how the wind felt 70 stories up. He asked about Martha, how she laughed, what she cooked, how they met. Arthur talked. He poured out the stories he had been holding inside. He told Frank about the pension, the hospital, the fear. Frank listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer cheap advice. He just listened, nodding, his blue eyes filled with a sadness that matched Arthur's. At the end of the hour, Frank stood up. He went to his jacket and pulled out a card. It wasn't money. It was a business card for a lawyer in Midtown. "This is my personal attorney," Frank said. "He's a shark, a real son of a bitch, but he's my son of a bitch. You go see him tomorrow. You tell him Frank sent you. He's gonna look into that pension fund merger, and he's gonna look into the hospital bill." Arthur tried to protest. "Mr. Sinatra, I didn't come here for charity." Frank put a hand on Arthur's shoulder. The grip was strong. "This isn't charity, Arthur. You built this city. The city owes you, and I owe you for reminding me who I am. I was getting lost out there, pal. I started believing my own press clippings. You woke me up." Arthur left Carnegie Hall that night, not with a check, but with his dignity restored. But the story didn't end there. Frank Sinatra was a man of his word. The lawyer took the case. It turned out the pension collapse involved illegal embezzlement. It became a massive class action lawsuit. It took 2 years, but they won. Arthur got his pension back, and so did 400 other workers. The hospital bill was settled quietly. Rumor had it that a check signed by a Francis A. Sinatra covered the entire balance, though Frank never confirmed it. Arthur Miller never became rich. He lived the rest of his life in a modest apartment in Queens, but he wasn't bitter anymore. He had a picture on his mantle, not of him and Frank, but a signed photo of Frank that said, "To Arthur." Arthur, the guy who built the skyline. Keep punching. Your friend, Frank. Years later, in 1998, when the news broke that Frank Sinatra had passed away, Arthur was 79 years old. He was in a diner having coffee. The radio played My Way. The other patrons were talking about the legend, the star, the chairman. Arthur listened for a moment, then tapped his spoon against his cup. He wasn't just a star, Arthur said to the waitress. Oh yeah, sweetie. You a fan? She asked. Arthur smiled, a genuine smile that reached his tired eyes. He was a guy who knew how to listen. He was a guy who knew that the silence between the notes is just as important as the music. Arthur went home that night and put on an old record. He didn't play My Way. He played One for My Baby. And in the scratchy silence of his living room, he raised a glass to the empty air. To you, Frank, he whispered. To us. That night in Carnegie Hall proved something that we often forget in our world of celebrities and idols. We think that strength is never showing weakness. We think that success is never having to say you're sorry. But Frank Sinatra, the toughest guy in the business, showed us that true strength is the ability to look at someone who hates you and see their pain instead of their anger. He showed us that underneath the tuxedos and the overalls, underneath the fame and the poverty, we are all just people sitting at a bar at 2:45, hoping someone will listen to our story. What Arthur Miller did took courage. He stood up to a giant. But what Frank Sinatra did took something rarer. It took grace. And in that exchange, both men were saved. So the next time you feel like the world has forgotten you, or the next time you see someone screaming in anger, remember Arthur and Frank. Remember that behind every scream is a wound. And sometimes, the only way to heal that wound is to stop the music, step off the pedestal, and just listen. If you believe that compassion is the true mark of a legend, subscribe for new stories and join us next time.